So good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Anne Proctor, and I am a journalist based in Dubai. I've been covering the Middle East and Africa for over 10 years now. And I'm really thrilled to be moderating this webinar tonight on the role of art centers in Africa, playing the role that they play in navigating a rapidly shifting landscape and world. We're obviously in a time of change. As we kind of joked about in the preparatory sessions, I mean, there really is no new normal if the normal keeps changing, you know, so we are in this period of unknown still. I'm going to say selfishly that this is a real treat for me because I really miss traveling to Africa. You know, I've been traveling so often. It's been several times a month for the last 3 years. And so this period of non-travel, why it's been a nice pause, I do miss it. So I think that I will enjoy, and obviously our audience will really enjoy hearing and kind of being vicariously on the continent through our panelists, which leads me to introduce our inspiring panelists tonight. Teesa Bahana, director of the 32 East Ugandan Arts Trust, renowned artist and founder of the Savannah Centre for Contemporary Art in Ghana, and Mirna Wessels, CEO of Spier Arts Trust in Cape Town, South Africa. And so we have a lot to cover today, so I want to jump right in and let the panelists speak. But in all, we're going to be really going from how the art centers, you know, these art centers, sort of grassroots institutions for art and culture and creativity in Africa have been coping with the very challenging effects brought on by COVID-19, how art centers in Africa are fostering change and enhancing creative and artistic dialogue. And lastly, the role that these art centers are having in terms of challenging, fostering, being safe places for challenging conversations. We're going to wrap up a bit with going back to, you know, what happened earlier in June, obviously the protests in the US and worldwide, and how art centers and art in general can act as means of change and hopefully enhancing positive dialogue through the arts in terms of challenging topics today. So I'd love to start first with Teesa and all the panelists to talk a little bit about their art center that they are directing at the moment and how they've handled the last few months of change. You know, how has the effects of COVID-19 really affected your particular center in Uganda?
So thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to the 154 team for the invite. Yeah, so change indeed. I run an art center called 32 Degrees East, as you mentioned, and we're based in Kampala. And we have a variety of programs. We really exist to serve visual artists, particularly with a focus on contemporary art. And we do that through our residency program. We have a library and resource center. We also host workshops. And we have a public art festival every 2 years called Kla Art. And essentially, with COVID, I mean, I think for a lot of us on the continent, we are sort of watching the news and seeing how different countries were responding and not really being sure exactly when it would hit us and just how. So, you know, just really being aware of what was going on and also paying very much attention to what the government was saying. We ended up closing our premises about a week before the government officially said that we were going into lockdown. And lockdown in Uganda had been really quite strict, I think, when you compare our country to other countries, in that we had a curfew. We still have a curfew. So at 7 p.m., everyone needs to be home. And originally as well, people couldn't use public transport or private transport. If you really had to use private transport, then you had to get special permissions from local government authorities. And so that then also meant that, you know, a lot of people were really quite stranded. There were quite a few issues with pregnant women not able to get medical care. And for a lot of our artists also just, you know, pretty quickly opportunities drying up just like that. You know, we operate in a field where, as you were saying, like people travel all the time. A lot of artists who had opportunities to travel, you know, those were gone pretty quickly. And then basic things like materials, budget for materials, how to access those. So lots of different things like that. So as a center, what we realized pretty quickly is that, if we say that we're here to work with visual artists and to serve them, how do we try to understand how this lockdown is affecting them? And so we took the first few weeks of being closed physically to continue operations online. So all of our team, brought out the laptops, tried to get connected to decent internet, and made a lot of calls to members of our community just to check in and see how people were doing, see how the lockdown was affecting them, both, in terms of these kinds of opportunities, but also mentally as well, in terms of anxiety and things like that. And also trying to just understand what it is that we could do to respond. I think it was important for us to not charge in and say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this without actually reaching out to people. So because of that, we then decided to look at trying to get materials budgets, trying to put together a quick emergency fund for artists to access. And so those are the immediate responses. And then now we're sort of in a phase of trying to see what's next. So we've moved to a lot of online programming, but I think, as we say, like, things are evolving a lot. So, I'll probably talk a bit more about that, but that was our initial response.
Okay, great. Well, yes, a lot has happened. I think it's sort of, challenging to find immediately. We were all sort of forced to make, as you were just saying, Teesa, to make these decisions really quickly in terms of how to go forward. Mirna, what was the situation in Cape Town? And obviously, Spier Arts Trust, how have you been handling obviously the lockdown situation, and now we are in reopening phases. Obviously, we all have different reopening phases around the globe, but how has that been for your particular art center?
Thanks, and to Ria and her team for the opportunity. Hello, everyone. I think it's quite important for me to explain a little bit about the context and what makes us different potentially to traditional art centers, because a lot of the questions that will come from here on will also need to fit into that framework. We started out not as a not-for-profit. Way back in the day, we were a commercially successful art consultancy. And over time, we grew into more of a developmental focus. We work really closely with organizations in a shared value environment where the organizations want to do business while doing good in society. So our purpose fits very well with that. We run what we call artist career development opportunity programs in curating collections for our patron partners. So we're not government funded, we don't have a community center, but we focus a lot on artist career development through our ecosystem of sourcing programs. So on the first hand, I suppose the reality was that our patron network was severely affected globally by lockdowns and the impact of COVID-19, which had a major impact on our ability to continue with sourcing and supporting artists in the way that we usually do. So we've had to really pull back on the programs that we are able to offer, but we continued with our baseline program, and we've been able to work with around 85 artists since the lockdown started in South Africa, which was the end of March. Also connecting with them in any way we possibly can. Digitally, we started doing Zoom sessions to make sure that we see them in their spaces, but it's not possible for everybody, obviously, to have access to data. So in some cases, it's phone calls. In some cases, it's just emails, and making sure that we understand where the pressing needs are really within our community. And then what else was, we worked with some other organizations who had established trusts, purchasing works there almost in a donation format to ensure that funds are available for vulnerable artists. So yeah, that's the context. And in our own studios, we run a mosaic studio and a bead studio in our building. So in the lockdown, obviously those people couldn't continue working. We couldn't continue with our learnership program. And as the government released the measurements that are required for social distancing and for making sure that we don't spread the virus, we were able to slowly bring them back. But the reality is that it's a real day-to-day mammoth task in managing things like cases that happen, positive infections that happen in that environment, making sure people feel safe and held, and that we respond responsively. And yeah, I think it's still very much a space of anxiety and uncertainty for us.
No, thank you so much. No, it is. I think we're all, again, struggling to find ways to, work with artists and view art, but also deal with safety precautions, and not forget them at times as well. Ibrahim, what's the situation been for you in Ghana, and particularly obviously at the Savannah Arts Trust with Arts Centre with the artwork that you've done there and working with the artists in Ghana?
Oh, well, thank you very much for this conversation, and to all my fellow colleagues and panelists. SCCA was founded on the basis of organizing retrospectives on older artists who had practiced in Ghana, mainly coming from like the 20th century. So the first exhibition that we did was dedicated to an artist, an 80-year-old artist, Kofi Dawson. Of course, the exhibition lasted 10 months. When it ended in January, we started a film screening program where we were talking to local filmmakers, showing some of the films that they had done, and also just doing like films, animation and things, because during the exhibition, we focused a lot of our strength on the workshop program with the school kids in the region. So after his exhibition, we're focusing on like these film screenings and preparing towards the next retrospective, which we're aiming to open in May. But obviously, due to the lockdown, we decided to close both the film screenings and then also not open the new retrospective. But of course, our library, we have a library which is open. So the library was still open to the public to use. So every once in a while, we do have people that come around. But in my own practice, I've been working around also just expanding the infrastructure within the institution, because we're looking forward towards doing bigger exhibitions in the future, or multiple exhibitions. And I've done a lot of research into archaeological sites and findings, and also looking at the idea of working with the National Collection to restore some of the old works which are in their collections, which are somehow which are decaying or they have issues. So we focus a lot of our energy on that. Of course, with SCCA, we don't operate alone. So we have a collective in Kumasi, Black Star Lines, and also the FCA, Foundation for Contemporary Arts in Accra, and also the Exit Frame Collective. So we've been in conversation with a lot of our colleagues about ways in which we can somehow restore and produce things, mainly within this moment. And one of the exciting things, aside the expansion of the infrastructure, has been teaching like young kids in the community various things, because a lot of schools have been closed. So a lot of my colleagues have been using their educational skills and teach capacities to somehow teach kids within the community. So we've been having various sessions of classes, of course, with taking all the measures in place with the current pandemic and all that. So basically, that's what we've been doing.
That sounds really exciting. The film, working with the community, very, very exciting. I can't wait to visit. In terms of dealing with the artists in the community, what have you all found? I think there have been questions circulating in terms of how has this sort of anxiety, the unknown, dealing with, yes, this terrible uncertainty when we can travel, when you can go to art fairs or meet collectors or even create art. Have you found that it's affected the artists at all, or do you find people are just creating their art as usual? Are you finding that the creativity, it's just gone on? Or maybe people have found ways, and you've obviously helped them find ways to continue art creation and dialogue. Maybe we can start first with Teesa.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it varies. It varies from artist to artist, right? Because people are going to be affected differently based off of their own temperament and how the situation is affecting them as an individual psychologically. A lot of people are dealing with anxiety and depression, and may have been dealing with that even before the pandemic. And I think for everywhere around the world, right, like it amplifies a lot of that kind of anxiety. And so that's something that quite a few artists that we've talked to have mentioned. But then there's also the economic reality, and that anxiety that comes from not knowing when your circumstances are going to change, and also to have, you're talking about art markets and art fairs and things like that, but I think for quite a few artists, it was just literally, they were doing a lot of different jobs at once just to get by in general, and then all of that goes, and so where do you even start? So I think for a lot of artists, it's also just that reality. So you might have been a pretty optimistic person and you're trying to do your thing, but then just you can be as resourceful as possible, but when the resources just are so limited, where do you even go? So I think quite a few artists are also really struggling and grappling with that, and coming up with new ways of making money just to get by. And then the other artists who we've spoken to who are really loving the lack of pressure, the change in pace, being able to stay at home, being forced to stay at home in many ways, and just really being able to hone in on something that they hadn't made time for in a while, or reflect on something that they hadn't thought about for a while. So there are some artists who are experimenting with new materials or new forms. So that's pretty exciting. But yeah, I think it really varies depending on the individual and their circumstance.
For sure. And obviously you're doing what you can to help as well. I have a friend who runs an art center in DRC, and he was saying that some of the artists, they're struggling to find food. And so the center there was, the gallery there was trying to provide, because obviously people need to eat to also create. And Mirna, how has I obviously hear, the situation, I hear the highs and the lows of Cape Town. What has it been for you? And how are you, you spoke about in the prep sessions a bit, what you've been doing also to help various situations, like Teesa has said, in terms of artists and their needs in this time.
Yeah, it's very similar, I think, to what Teesa's saying, is that it's so varied. Within the community, the situation and the context at home or in studio is so different, and not only that sort of transpires in whether somebody is inspired or able to continue with work, but in many cases the concern has gone right back to, well, how am I actually going to feed my family? So it's very tough. It's not, we don't really have answers for those things.
Yeah. And Ibrahim, if you talk a little bit about what's going on in Accra or Kumasi, or where you're based, or maybe are the collectives, are people just going on as usual, or do you feel like you're maybe mentoring more than before? Or?
Yeah, sorry, the line is breaking, so sometimes it just
do you
pauses
mean to repeat?
Yeah, so well, we though with SCCA, though we are using art as a starting point, the community around us is also very important. Actually, the reason for building this institution was because of the community in which it's situated in. So with regards to the labor forms that somehow brings the institution together in order, one of the difficult things to have done within the COVID period was to keep the center open, because every day we have we have to maintain the infrastructure, of course, pay the workers, keep the place intact. And we just had to do it because at the end of the day, my practice sustains the institution because we don't get any funding from anywhere, not yet. So the decision was whether to continue opening the center, because once in a while you have one person come in the space to use the library. So because of one person a day, we would have to keep the entire workforce. And for me, I thought that was really important because to really acknowledge the work that these people are putting into it in the first place. And also the expansion of the infrastructure, finding the money to pay these people who are building these spaces, because at the end of the day, they have to feed their families and they have to take care of themselves. And for us at the institution, it's very, very important, in as much as the works of art which would end up being in the space. I think that the labor force that keeps these things running within these communities was one thing that we really wanted to somehow sustain within the COVID period.
I mean, I love what you say, and it's something I really believe in. And art, the role of art in the community, to enhance the community, to speak to the masses, and that's kind of where I'd like to get to next. Covering the Middle East and Africa for the last decade, I do believe that sometimes the artists, in some ways, kind of even have more of a document, a pulse on what's happening, even maybe than me as a journalist, because they really are, inside, feeling, their own society, the country that they're from. I mean, the issues that are happening. And I feel that, you as art centers, as places that aren't, obviously influenced as heavily by the art market, although maybe you'll beg to differ from me, because obviously we do need funding, we do need money to get things going. But how do you believe, what is the role of your center of art to bring about change in society? It's a big question. But I think it's a beautiful question, because you're serving your community, and we spoke about it, Ibrahim, in one of the sessions. But art has a role to go beyond just sort of the arts crowd, but hopefully to change perception, to bring people together, to enhance creativity, and maybe even through creativity you can enhance economic growth. Now that's, I'm talking too much, so I'll go back to Teesa. And how do you, what are some of the really inspiring initiatives that you've been doing to kind of, be catalysts for change through the arts?
Very good question again. I next time start with someone else so I can steal some of their ideas.
No,
but it's fine. It's fine. So one of the things we do is our public arts festival, Kla Arts, and we had to postpone that this year. So it was supposed to take place in August. And really a key value behind it is that art should be accessible, and it's really about bringing art into non-traditional spaces to non-traditional audiences. So, I mean, in general, in Uganda, there's not a lot of infrastructure for the arts, so it's not like people are regularly going to a national gallery or art museum or anything like that. But then it means, like, for an average citizen, where do you see art? And it was actually one of the reasons why I was chatting to Mirna about the work Spier does with Nando's, because it's a way of bringing art to people who wouldn't ordinarily get to view it and respond to it. And so the festival is really about bringing art to people and trying. I mean, there are very varying reasons for it, but part of it is to stimulate dialogue and be able to facilitate different discussions that wouldn't ordinarily happen. And I think art can be, particularly public arts, can be a very, very strong vehicle for bringing up, these kinds of uncomfortable conversations, or conversations across different people who maybe wouldn't interact in the same way. But, you look at something and you're like, do you understand what that is? I actually think it's this. What do you think? And all of a sudden, it's two people from different walks of life who are having a conversation about something very real. And so I think, for us, one of the reasons why we love to put on the festival is to create moments like that, particularly living in a country where, what it means to gather in public is often very politicized. Right now, during COVID, even giving out food has been politicized. So you can't actually give out food to crowds because you might be arrested for attempted murder. That's basically what the government said, because they want to reduce spread of COVID. But that means that, they had their motives for doing that, to, reduce opposition politicians' power for, saying, oh, we've given out food, so vote for us. So basically, anytime people gather in public in Uganda, there's often, there's a bit of a threat to that. And so bringing public art to people allows a way of going around that threat and sort of navigating that and bringing up, these kinds of conversations. And then also, aside from freedom of expression, sometimes people just want to see really cool things and experience awe and experience spectacle and feel small or feel bigger, or just be able to see the world differently, and being able to have those moments and that perspective, I think shifts how you see yourself in the world, what you think is possible. And so all of those things, all of those interactions, I think, change society. You don't change society without individuals having a transformative experience. So that's a big way that we try and do that. And so hopefully we'll be able to have the festival next year, but we're continuing to do our programming and push that online as well.
I love what you said in your last line. You can't change society without individuals undergoing a transformative experience. And and art is transformative. So if you really think about it, the artwork that you're viewing or the exhibition, whatever, if that can make you feel something, then that can change. And I believe in that. So that's, very powerful. And Mirna, I've been following for a long time the Nando's work. And at first I remember when I first saw the Nando's sign, I thought, this doesn't make sense. I just don't know. I don't get it. But then when you really see it at, the 154 exhibitions in London, and, it opens your eyes. And again, it's the beauty of the I don't even know how to say it, cross-sector art pollination, if you could so say. So explain a little bit about that program, and it's really bringing art to people who might not even have thought about getting into the arts.
Yeah, that's true. The wonderful platform that Nando's does provide is the accessibility, as Teesa mentioned, to South African art, to South African culture. And it fits beautifully in with the brand context, in that they want to tell the story of their origin. I think not a lot of people know that Nando's is from South Africa. So that sort of creates the link. But in many ways, it's really contributing towards the business's ethos, in the sense that that sort of allows them to create unique restaurants. Every single restaurant, Nando's restaurant around the world, is a different experience. And I think if people live in an environment where there's maybe 4 or 5, they probably like to go to different ones to have a different experience. On the one hand, it's family restaurants, so one has to be careful about the context that you present some of the works in, and that makes it a little bit challenging, but that really opens up an opportunity for dialogue and discussion, for allowing people to get to understand the different contexts. Somebody in Europe might be offended by something that would be quite normal for someone in South Africa to experience and depict. And I think those conversations are also really important. I wanted to also add that we also mustn't forget that it's not a given. The artistic expression, freedom of artistic expression is not possible everywhere in the world. And even in our country 30 years ago, the work that would have commented on political structures and that would just not have seen the light of day, especially in our country. So I think that's what makes the Nando's collection so exciting, is that it is a post-apartheid collection, and it talks about that renewed freedom of expression. People still comment about social issues. Very often people want to have fun and joy when they go to restaurants. But I think when you delve deeper into the meaning of the works and the artists behind the work, these stories really do come to the fore. So it's a very rich expression of South African culture that is available for the whole world to experience.
Yeah, no, it's always been I've been to South Africa so many times. It's always been very inspiring to see the mix of, well, really how sort of the past it marries with the present in so many different ways through the art. And people obviously the artists, it's obviously getting through some of the trauma or whatever. We're obviously have all gone through trauma with the last few months, but how that kind of is still working its way through the art. Ibrahim, when we were speaking, I think the first time you mentioned the idea of going beyond form through art, and sort of the role of art in politics or in society. Maybe you could explain a bit more this idea of, going beyond the form. I mean, your work is highly conceptual. I mean, some of the work that we've seen at the Venice Biennial and other, really large scale public artworks. How does that, going beyond form, how does that tap into, I'm thinking also of the one I saw, I can't remember the name, I'm sorry, it was in Milan last year when I drove by the car.
A friend.
Yeah, and it's so powerful. You want to stop your car and just stop and look and be like, what is this? So maybe you can explain a bit more about that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Yes, so yeah, thank you. Yes, so what I meant by the going beyond the form is that I trained as a painter at the university, so both from undergrad, MFA, and currently at the PhD level. So the idea has always been because sometimes we think, because art, no matter what you do, always ends up somehow being very elitist, because no matter what you do, your work will always end up in the arts museum or in the art gallery, which already issues regarding representation, it cuts away 99% of the population from the experience of the work. So in art school, the question was always how to produce art. Maybe sometimes people think that it's the system of art that's where the problem comes from. But I think maybe why not change the form that art can take? So hence thinking about painting in a sense that can be the covering, like taking the form of the buildings or taking a form of objects which somehow expand or even talk about the human condition in such a way that the body itself cannot maybe articulate that. Then realizing that there is a huge deficit when it comes to, let's say, the cultural institutions and infrastructure within the country. There is a lot of the work that I've done on building these institutions have been inspired by some of the buildings that I covered in the last couple of years since I started working on collecting drawings from these spaces. But then again, also, there are buildings, for instance, there are some buildings that were built back in the early 1960s, post-independent era, when Ghana was trying to build its cultural scene and all that. And some of these buildings were abandoned. So my question has always been, how does the contradictions of art in itself come back to somehow liberate or resurrect the ghosts, the ghosts that live among us? So by using, let's say, the money that I would ordinarily have earned through my work, but through an art fair, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would come back to Ghana and establish an art gallery, but maybe I can use that money to buy this old building, which was probably meant as a factory. But then now, because of the ghosts that this building has accumulated, it can act as a cultural institution, and the history of that space can somehow guide it in a different way. So art in itself somehow changes its character and its form. And suddenly the space can become a place of gathering where people can enter this mode of not just reflecting, but it can also change the way in which they relate to one another and also the things around them within their society. So by then, the attitude of painting in its sense would have taken a very different form, because now it's not something that is commodified or something that is an object that you can buy, but suddenly it transforms into a space which democratizes the way that people experience the world and the content that is produced out of it. Yeah, so it's very political. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's almost it's almost impossible to sort of strip the politicism, of art. And as you're saying, these spaces, I mean, I remember the first time I went to Accra and I went to Chaliwati in Jamestown, and going into those old buildings, and they have such strong energy, but yet they're, the past is marrying with the present, and obviously it's exactly as you're saying, and that's that's change right in front of you. It's a change. So that's but again, you're not forgetting the past. It's using, correct me, I mean, you're sort of moving forward in a positive way, which it sounds like, all of you are doing in your respective places. And that brings me to kind of the last section before we open this up to questions. And it's probably the more, I don't want to say challenging, because I think it's better we don't look at things challenging, otherwise they're going to become challenging. But what happened, it would be impossible for me to kind of, moderate this webinar, thanks to 154 and Tori and her amazing team, not speak about and sort of, glaze over the really challenging protests that happened in the US, where I'm from originally, and then went all over the world, that triggered by the death of George Floyd, and obviously the ongoing systematic racism, and obviously there's the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to ask each of you, and feel free, whoever wants to speak first, obviously if you need to kind of digest a bit more, but what is the role of an, I don't want to put someone on the spot, but what is the role that, as you've said, and there's obviously, I wish I could ask more questions, but we do need to kind of stick within a time frame, but you're also dealing, as Mirna and Teesa was saying as well, with different sort of levels of, maybe we say self-censorship as well, or how do you relate to the past or these difficult subjects through art? This situation that's happened has really just, everyone wants to talk now. They want to come out and deal with this pain, this trauma that's still very much in the air. And obviously Africa is, Black Lives Matter. This is, African American, what's happened over there, but it's affecting the entire world. It's bringing up pain from colonialism. How do you address that? What happened? How has it been in sort of Uganda and South Africa and Ghana? What was the response to what happened? I mean, this talk was originally supposed to happen, I think 2 days after after George Floyd's death. So we've had some space here to reflect. A lot has happened. Yeah, what has been the reaction, and how does art come into that dialogue? I feel like I just spoke too much. Yeah. I'm trying to deal with a variety of layers to this very complex topic that is ongoing, and be sensitive to it at the same time, because we're all dealing with it. We're all struggling with the emotions in different ways, depending on the context that we're based in or where we're from. So how has it been?
Oh, I think that art, for us, art has always been dealing with the crisis. Yeah, not just crisis with regards to the times that we live in, but crisis with regards to I've been talking a lot about ghosts recently. And sometimes when you talk about ghosts, people think that ghosts are, they are somehow manifestations of the past, things that are somehow come from the past to haunt us. But sometimes ghosts are also a manifestations of things which are yet to become. Because after slavery was abolished in the US, between that time and now, there were a lot of things which should have been addressed, particularly with regards to issues regarding freedom. But it was never really addressed. So the ghosts of the past have always been haunting the United States. And of course, the United States is the largest economy in the world. So a lot of decisions that they make somehow as the rest of the world, of course, it does affect the art market, which in turn also affects us within how we are able to raise whatever capital that we raise in doing our own work. So for us here, that's why it's always been very important for us to really address the core of the matter with regards to looking at the inequalities that are already somehow embedded within our society with regards to experience, and also when it comes to production values, how art is made and how art is perceived, and also the form that art has taken over the years. Because sometimes people think that with regards to issues regarding representation only happens when the human form is only worked with, and the work can also end up in a way that can be consumed. But sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to end up in that form which can be consumed. Maybe it has to be process-based in a way that can really reorient even the production systems within the world and society itself. That's when we actually confront history, and we confront the ghosts, both within the past and ones which are yet to emerge on a daily basis. So with regards to what happened with the murder of George Floyd, and combining it with the pandemic, we don't have to forget that, because without the pandemic, George Floyd's murder, I don't think it would have actually had that magnitude that it's had today. Sure. So I think that both of those have really somehow exposed the wound, the deep wound that has been within our most modern history within the last 200 years, for us to really go back to and confront. So for me, I think it's a very good confrontation. And we hope that at least post-COVID and then post this era, the existing forms of relations, not just within the United States between the African American community and the general population, but then also the relationship between the West, the North and the South, everything will change.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was, yeah, wonderful to listen
like
to.
snaps. Yeah.
I love the
Gosh,
metaphor
yeah.
of ghosts.
So
Yeah.
good. So good.
Maybe we'll have new ghosts soon. Hopefully, happy ghosts.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just thinking about how the King of Belgium just apologized to basically the whole of DRC for their colonial history. You know, just, I mean, all of these things, like with COVID, obviously, there was this unprecedented, and it sort of opened up what unprecedented can mean for everything. You know, all of these kinds of conversations that we never really would have imagined happening, the way that people have responded here. I think one, in terms of solidarity, you know, there have been marches and protests on the continent, specifically around George Floyd's murder, and then also speaking to police brutality within our own context that has been happening for a while, that also was, you know, amplified with enforcing curfews and things like that. But then also, you know, you mentioned colonization and colonialism and how, you know, this question of decolonizing our curriculums. In Uganda, we have all these street signs that, you know, people have been talking about for a while, but now there's this, you can't ignore so many of these things as much now, right? Because so many people have been talking about these things, particularly in the art world, especially like the non-commercial art world, I think, as well, because it allows for, you know, these more critical conversations. And so it's more now that, one, these conversations are being heard more by the people in power, but also the reasons why they're being heard as well is because there's fear and accountability attached to it as well. Like, it's not always, you know, good motives of people thinking, oh, now we want to be good companies and good brands and good people. Often there is, you know, there's a threat behind it as well, that, you know, you need to pay attention. You have a responsibility, and you will be called out if you do not respond. And so, you know, now it's sort of thinking through, how do we use a lot of these conversations that have emerged to then move to action? So, you know, we've been talking about reparations for a while, both particularly in the African American context, but I think also in terms of all of these countries that were colonized, you know, like, what does that mean as well? What does that look like? And how do we also start pushing for those kinds of real, massive structural change? Because again, what COVID unearthed is that this old way of living, these inequalities, this was broken, right? And so how do we think about fixing it, not just in talking about it, but actually pushing and moving for real change?
Yes.
And our art, Mirna, you know, South Africa, obviously, for the last, as you just mentioned, the art has changed as well. As you know, you're dealing with the post-apartheid South Africa. There are a lot of wounds and scars there are all over Africa, and obviously, you know, Europe and North America. What has been the reaction?
So South Africans certainly joined the world in expressing anger and solidarity. There were protests with our lockdown regulations. Mass gatherings were not possible that much, but you did see protest action. But was interestingly, local critics pointed out that there was not such a vehement, quick response against death of South African civilians, such as Collins Khoza, at the hands of police and the Defence Force just very shortly before the Floyd murder. So they were bringing it closer to home, questioning why there seems to be more apathy than action when this systemic issue still continues to happen in our country. And then one positive, I suppose, was that the protest action and pressure from the public had resulted in a High Court order against brutality during the enforcement of the coronavirus lockdown. In terms of an institutional response, I strongly feel that art centres are very well placed to create safe spaces for artists to really find a way to give voice to those things. And we have to allow those very difficult and confrontational discussions to happen somehow, so that people in an open, engaging way learn from each other. Because, I mean, you refer to pain, but pain relates to those who it was inflicted on, as well as those who had inflicted. And it's a long process of trying to really face those things on a daily basis, and trying to understand what those implied and inherent beliefs are that one has to challenge on a daily basis. And art does help with that, certainly does help with that.
That's so true, the pain that's been inflicted or felt inflicted from both sides. And to kind of wrap up before then I finally go into questions, which I'm sure there'll be a lot. Wrapping up with a bit of a call to action, you know, how can art centers like yours, and you've kind of touched upon it already, address this trauma or the challenges, you know, obviously you've already said, you know, safe spaces through research, lobbying, writing, art creation, even fundraising. You know, you're obviously, we didn't touch too heavily into that because I thought, you know, maybe that will come up with the questions, but you know, you're really catalysts for the community. What tools, what sort of calls to action can you, I mean, are you planning to take, or have you been taking to kind of, be sources of change right now, even in the midst of these very difficult, these still very challenging times of the unknown? Or what do you believe that perhaps maybe something that, you know, that you're interested in implementing, or in the future, or collaborations, arts, and we didn't touch upon that. There's a question coming up about that, but you know, community driven as well, obviously, between different art centers and institutions.
So I'd like to go on that one.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I think that we, in our purpose, we focus on social transformation in our context. So all our programs are geared towards providing career development opportunities, having an impact on individual artists, and allowing freedom of expression, so that there's almost a true capture of history, as opposed to it being hidden through the forces that be, I suppose. And then we have a education program for young South Africans that uses art in, so we teach them mosaic, the skill of mosaic, and they're trained to interpret art with the idea that they will go back into their communities and stimulate different ways of seeing, opening up conversations, and again, challenging those already set views and beliefs that exist in their communities. We can always do more, but that's just sort of the way that we have dealt with it over time.
And Teesa or Ibrahim, what sort of, you've been speaking about the exhibitions you have upcoming and the films and everything, but maybe are there other sort of, I guess you'd say, you know, through art, are the tools that or we'd say, art creation as a way for change that you're sort of implementing as a response to particular response to what's been happening?
I think for us, it's the infrastructural developments that we are trying to concentrate on within this period, because we know that it's very much needed in the future to come and now, because that is what has been lacking for so many years, particularly also when it comes to the continent, because we've never really had, even when it comes to issues regarding repatriation and all that, sometimes when there is this conversation about returning lost objects from the West back to Africa, then it becomes a problem, or then what happens to these objects and all that. So there has been a real need for our institution to somehow look into some of these things. So one of the things that we're doing a lot within this period was working with local kids in the community and teaching them drone technologies. Because one of the projects that I did, I bought these old airplanes, which I transported to the institution. So we were trying to transform the interiors into learning spaces. And then in a way start teaching technology. Like we started having these technological classes where we were teaching the kids the relationship between, let's say, a drone and then, let's say, the framework of an airplane. Yeah, like looking at some of these relationships and all that. So for us, currently, one of the most important conversations that we are having is having with these the archaeology department at the university in Accra, and then also like archaeological sites and villages around the country, where there are many objects which have been uncovered over years and years, and they've somehow been left there, protected, or sometimes they end up in the black market, or they end up in Western institutions. So how do we, let's say, take responsibility for these things and creating spaces that somehow, because it's a leap from the contemporary. So that's why I've been talking about this idea of art as a gift. So how do we change, by changing the form of art, it means that once you start looking into infrastructure, and then you start looking into archaeology and all these historical bases, then you can begin to create institutions that somehow rewrite or realign the narratives of even, let's say, the similar objects which happen in the British Museum they would frame in a Western context. So we're trying to build spaces that somehow change the whole perception and also ideological basis under which a lot of young people grow up and operate with the world around us. So we're gradually creating infrastructure that eventually we hope will change the way in which the society will see the world in which they live in.
Changes, yeah, thank you. No, wonderful. Changes in perception. Yeah.
Just to respond to the question super quickly, well, infrastructure is a really big one for us too. Like we're right in the middle, or we have been in the middle of a capital campaign project to build a new center. And I think, you know, it's been something we've been working on for a while, but doing that now in this moment, I think also just gives it this, or gives us, as we're working on it, this energy, because it's really reflecting and considering what kind of world we want to create, and thinking about what we felt has been lacking, what kind of spaces have been lacking for us. And, you know, you mentioned art centers working for communities, but really also trying to think, how can we not have that separation where we are the community, right? Like if we have that separation, you know, how do we make sure that the people we're working with don't feel like that this is theirs, this is their center, they are contributing, they are a huge part of creating the kind of world that they want to see, even in a building, right? So I think for us, that's been really motivating, to just feel like we're investing in a future that is sort of going against so much of what we've been feeling during this time as well.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a major theme. There's so many different wonderful sound bites you could take away from this panel. It's been so enriching. I've also learned a lot, but this idea of community, which obviously we do know from an art center, but breaking down those boundaries of what we see art and, you know, contemporary art scene as this elitist scene, and, you know, art reaches the masses, that we live in a visual world. You know, our everything that we see every day is influencing us in some way. Sometimes I wonder if images, even though I'm a writer, sometimes I wonder if an image has more power than the words. It obviously depends on the words that are said, but yeah. And so I think that gives change, and that's something that's really powerful. We obviously could go on and on, but I'm gonna start with some questions. Otherwise it will go on all night, which obviously would be great as well, but for everybody else. So question number one, there seems to be more and more collaborative projects between galleries during this crisis. Is that something that is also happening between art centers on the continent? Do you have any collaborative projects coming up?
Something I think that is really important, and we are exploring at the moment who it would make sense to work with. You know, with art centers, we all have very particular purposes and missions, and I think one has to really evaluate at this time whether those things are still relevant and impactful, and see when it makes sense to rather reimagine something, or not start something new, but work with somebody else who's already have it established. I think that we will see more of it, definitely, which is very exciting.
Great.
Yeah, we're very fortunate in that we are a part of a few different international networks, one of which is Arts Collaboratory, which is specifically around the Global South. So art centers who have very different, but also are dealing with similar histories or similar themes in their work. And so that's, I think, been such an amazing lifeline to have during the time, just in terms of checking in with people. And, almost, I think even, when you are doing the admin work, sometimes there are, weights to that as well. And you don't always want to put that onto the artists you're working with. And so also being able to have your peers that you can, it's not necessarily a collaborative project, but I think in some ways it is, thinking through processes, thinking through, how can you build and support each other mentally, and share resources as well. So it was actually through that network that we were able to put a fund together in each one of our spaces. That was a really small fund, just temporarily, but really for artists to be able to access something. I think one thing we've seen for a lot of us is that there've been so many emergency grants out there for artists, particularly in the West, but not much happening in Africa. So, being able to do things like that, again, responding to need, responding to our immediate context. And then I think thinking a bit further, once once we respond to one phase of a new normal and then another new normal happens, how do you then think through what kinds of projects might make sense? So I think right now it's sort of more in the thinking stage, but at least we have been fortunate to have connections. And I think Zoom has made it so easy as well. Not a sponsorship for Zoom, but I think, it's just so easy, I think, to jump on the phone with someone, or like, I'm going to email Mirna and Ibrahim and say, let's talk more. How can we work together? Yeah. And people, I think, are really open to that as well. So I think that kind of collaboration is going to happen even more.
Is there anything anyone wants to
No, I
add?
think they've said a lot. So.
Okay, great. The second question I have here is, did the international context these last few months encourage you to think of and develop new programs within your art centers? I think maybe we have addressed that a little bit, but if anyone wants to add anything about specific art programs that have been influenced.
No, I think for us, we at the SCCA and its affiliates, education is very important to us. So it's one of the things that we've taken very seriously. Yeah, as I mentioned before, one of the things that we're doing within this period is working with a few groups of school kids and all that. And sometimes you realize that even within the educational system itself, it's so inadequate, even with regards to maybe certain very basic things that ordinarily you would expect that kids will know within school, but they don't. So in terms of filling that deficit, and I've always thought that it's very important to somehow think about the institution in such a way that it can act as as an educational facility, one which can both collaborate with the existing schools to somehow work with their students, and then probably through either exhibitions or inviting artists, architects, engineers, or whoever to come there to work with them through whether the objects that are produced in these centers or even just through theory or text-based. So education is definitely something that we've really thought about within this period.
Okay, great. Well, I love the idea also, just to say, I mean, I think it's so important to start, children, what you're doing work with the kids, to getting children to work at a young age with art. It's, it changes their life, I think, so here we have a question about funding, which is something I didn't get as much into in the actual talk, but how much do you depend on private funding, and do you think the economical crisis will impact your fundraising processes? How much will this impact your platform in the mid to long term?
Well, I fund the space myself so far, so I raise my hands up. I don't worry or think about any of these things. so, so, yeah, but I think definitely, of course, in not being able to sell your artwork because of the crisis, it's going to affect us. There are many things that we want to do, but we would have to wait on it and do it later. Eventually, we hope that we'll get funding to be able to sustain the institution, but currently, we haven't gotten to that point yet. So sometimes I feel a bit grateful to be able to at least just navigate through. But I'm sure with Teesa and Bremer from Cape Town, they will, it's a very different situation. So maybe they should, speak a bit more on this.
Well, as I've explained.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, Teesa.
No, go ahead.
On a funding model, rather, we have a commercial relationship. We're providing a service, but in a shared environment. And we are being affected, obviously, by organizations' ability to continue with that. But we know that they are committed, so there is not a risk in terms of the continuity of the organization. But I think that the reality is that we have to critically evaluate all our programs, as I've said previously, and make sure that those are still fit for purpose, meeting demand, establish whether there's different new demands now, new needs in the ecosystem, and go beyond our current, we have to go beyond our current patron network.
Yeah, for us, I mean, a lot of our funding so far has come from foundations, particularly based in Europe in terms of our largest funders. And so that probably, that might change over the next few years depending on their particular priorities, because they receive their funds from Ministry of Culture or from other groups that, depending on the crisis, that might change. But that's also a big reason why investing in infrastructure became such a big priority for us, so that we do have something that we can own that enables us a bit more flexibility in terms of making decisions, like what programs are we going to cut, what can we afford to actually still keep hosting because we have a building, because we have the space that we can rent out, because we have this tenant, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I think, in some ways, we're in environments where you've been forced to be resourceful from the beginning because you're not depending on large amounts of government funding because they don't exist. And so, yes, we do anticipate some of our funding in the future going down. We have had a really good relationship with a lot of our funders. And so we've also been able to shift some of that funding to directly help some of our artists. But it's also this question of, we also have to think through our existence as well. So I think that's also going to continue to be a struggle over the next few months or years. Gosh.
Yes.
Well, hopefully not, but obviously where there's a will, there is a way. I have to believe that. I have a few more questions here. So actually, I'm going to direct this to you, Ibrahim. This is for you. Following from what Ibrahim has said about structural change within institutions and those conversations happening often beyond representation, is the decision to self-fund SCCA a political decision or due to exterior circumstances?
One, it was a political decision because we just had to do it. No one is going to give you any funding to do anything here, and you do understand that. Just this afternoon, I was having a conversation with one colleague of mine that for some reason here, our damnation is our salvation to begin with. You know that you don't have anything to begin with because there are no private donors, or even the government doesn't really fund the visual arts. So there is a lot of work that an artist has to be able to do in order to self-promote and do their own work. And I've also seen situations where artists or individuals have started projects which are really interesting, but because of external funding at a very early age, the project or the institution gets corrupted away. So for us, I think it was very important for us to somehow crack through. It's very difficult to do that, but at least to be able to build the institution based on the promise of having nothing, to be able to sacrifice everything that comes out of the work and put it back into building this institution. Of course, there is a lot of land and other things which we've invested money into, hoping that in the future we can go into agriculture and all these other things, which can also raise other capitals, which can help sustain the institution. But of course, you can't operate in isolation. So every once in a while, I think it's important for us to collaborate with other institutions, even if there is funding, external funding involved, to be able to expand our program, and also to be able to maybe expand the infrastructure to meet more the demands that come from like the community around us in terms of how they consume the program and then everything. So
yeah, okay, that's very well said. This is directed to you, Mirna. Mirna, how does the art that you have in Nando's restaurants, basically, how does it work? Does Spier Arts pay the artists directly? This is what this question is about.
Yes, we do. So we ensure that they get paid very soon after works are selected. And our programs work in such a way that we were continuously sourcing from 4 main centers in South Africa. So we would visit 1 a week, and different programs run at any given time. And the longest period that an artist would wait for payment would be 2 weeks. So we carry a lot of stock, which we then present to Nando's, either to, it depends on the structure, but very often it's to designers or property directors. And then they sort of build their collections for the restaurants specifically.
Okay, great. The last question I'm going to read here. How do you see your organization's role in representing local populist discourse within a global conversation, both typically and in this rapidly shifting, quote, rapidly shifting, I guess from our title, moment? I am wondering about where you locate the power of the African people to shift or contribute to a globalist discourse. Do you want me to read it again, or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, can you read it again?
How do you see your organization's role in representing local populist discourse within a global conversation? That's the first.
I think it's a much simple one, because for us, in as much as we're making art which is inspired by the world, but at the same time, it's very important to start from the local. So hence, the art as a gift that we've been talking about. There's so much content already within local communities and all that. But contemporary art, unlike any other art form in history from the modernist tradition, somehow promises immense total freedom, democracy, and all that. So one comes to believe that if you're not in this, nothing really has to happen within a certain given center or within the city. So even if you go to, let's say, your village, which is in the middle of nowhere, and there are a group of kids there who have access to, let's say, a classroom or whatever, and they're studying and they can build upon their intellect and all that. Why not even use that as a starting point to somehow develop a small infrastructure which can go a long way to even allow them to create multiple perspectives that they can start to look at the world from. And that alone in itself can go a long way to somehow really empower them to think about their role as human beings within the world very differently. Because sometimes some people feel that, oh, they are only occupants of the earth, because sometimes we make these jokes in Ghana where we say, oh, we feel like we only came to escort some other people in the world. But definitely it's not true. We're all participants within this world. And we all have a strong intellect. But one thing that is mostly lacking is information and equal opportunity and creating equal platforms across board. So at least once we start to do that, the rest of the world will immediately realize that, oh, of course, the narrative within the continent is not what it is as we know it to be. there's opportunity, people are creating their own intellectual discourse and blah, 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 and then it goes on and on forever.
Yeah, I think for us, it's really in agreement with so much of that. And it's about creating or building on the kind of environment, providing the kind of resources for artists to then do what they will with it, like considering how in so many of our contexts, there might be some really incredible artists who are just looking for community or looking for time, space, materials, information, a good connection to the internet. And so, by being able to provide that, if they do want to then, build a career around having this international presence, then that's up to them. But they are not limited. They no longer have those limitations that they had before. And so for us, it's really about being a space to enable them to do what it is that they want to do within their careers, rather than us saying that, we are lifting you up onto a global platform. If they want that, then let's help them do that. If for them, it's really important to be very embedded in the local community and, working with 3 people for the, and building mentorship relationships with their younger peers or whatever, then, how can we help them do that too? So I think that's really our focus and orientation towards that question.
Okay, I'll try and end. If one looks at structures like what 154 provides, they're very well placed to do just that. And I think to try and build something that either competes or surpasses that doesn't really seem feasible to me. So that's where the collaboration, partnerships, and making sure that one has relationships in those networks become really, really important. I don't see us, for instance, starting even an international residency, because there's already so many of that being offered in South Africa with other institutions that are related to the Triangle Group. And yeah, I think that we would, it would make any sense to try that on our own.
Well, thank you. Thank you huge thanks to 154, kind of, adding on what Mirna just said. Without 154 and Toria and her amazing team, we wouldn't be able to have this talk today. And it's, I'm sitting in Dubai, Toria's in London, I think, or the team is around, I'm not sure where they are, but they're around Europe, I'm pretty sure. And then Cape Town, Accra, and in Kampala in Uganda. That's pretty incredible. And so I think in terms of a global conversation, that's what we've had today, and that's pretty powerful right now. Thanks, obviously, to Zoom without sounding too like it's a campaign. But it's really grateful also to the audience for participating and for being here and for the wonderful questions. And yes, I think there's a lot of belief in the power of art despite, these challenging circumstances. But there's been challenging circumstances pre-COVID, as someone at a gallery told me in Zimbabwe. I was doing an interview about 2 months ago, and she sort of laughed. She said, this isn't new to us. We've been dealing with challenges for ages, and it's the challenge, like what Ibrahim was saying, that sometimes the challenge, the restrictions, the having almost nothing actually gives you something. It pushes you forward. A gallerist said that to me in Beirut as well, about a year ago, that sometimes, when you have nothing to lose, you have everything to gain. And so I think it's a very exciting time. But thank you all again, and it's been a real treat to speak to you and moderate this talk. And thanks again to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks to the great audience. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.